with the patriarchy concept, I've always seemed to go, okay, so you're saying there's been a conspiracy across all times and all places where men want to put women down, and this somehow predates continents being discovered and languages being disentangled and instant communication, but humanity somehow some kind of hive mind that acts in concert to keep women down. But it's
Mm,
also entirely socially constructed and isn't rooted in
mm,
any biology.
mm.
How do you square that circle? So
Well, I mean,
perplexing to me.
it's certainly. I try not to give too many history lessons on my account because that's not what I'm here to do. I'm talking about 2023, although of course the current day is informed by history. But I find like even historically speaking, although it was more patriarchal, I would say women were limited and held back, especially excluded from the workforce, not by men, but because of their reproductive system. And if you actually just think about what it was like 200 years ago, in the 1800s, a child had a 50-50 chance of making it to its fifth birthday. So children would have to have several children. No one went to school, so that mother had to educate all those children herself. She had to cook and clean and provide for those children without any of the sort of microwaves or ovens that we have today. And it was a hard job. Like children are dying, and obviously childbirth is traumatic. And mothers often died themselves. They had to raise and educate these children like several at a time. And also like pre-industrial revolution, like the work we're talking about wasn't like we're doing now, where we can sit here typing away. It was hard. It was physically hard work, required lots of physical strength and stamina. And like if someone has to go and plow a field, that should obviously be the man because the man is obviously stronger and more physical and has a greater sense of stamina. And the woman is burdened more so by her reproductive system. So I would say there's a far better, more high definition discussion to be had around history that is apolitical and just a bit more common sense. And I know people say like white goods did more to liberate women than any feminist, and there was certainly some truth in that when you consider how much labor saving those devices did for women and how much it helped them get out of home and back into the workforce for the first time. So I would I'm an advocate of high resolution discussion that is apolitical and not fundamentally about pitting women against men as the patriarchy too often does. And the more we go on, the more patriarchy theory just doesn't make sense, and we got to see it as like a 50-year-old, very regressive ideology that doesn't really paint with any sort of detail and only causes like more and more anger and more erasure of, especially of men and boys who are victims.
Yeah, this is the for the Schlafly quote of the washing machine has done more to liberate women than feminism. So also
Yeah.
my friend Mary Harrington's recent book went into the history of the development of feminism as a response to the Industrial Revolution, where
Mm,
Marx was writing about poor women who had to take their kids to the factory and drug them with opiates just to stop them crying so they could get on with industrial production. Of course, you're going to have a large scale social movement that comes out of those difficult and painful situations, and it might not have been the right response, but
mm,
it was in some way inevitable because of the technology and the political
mm,
circumstances of the time. The problem that Mary says is that if feminism neglects mothers, then feminism has a motherhood problem. It's not that mothers have a feminism problem. And I would extend the same to the opposite sex. I mean, if feminism fails to consider men as human beings that actually women might
mm,
grow to like and love, then
mm.
feminism has an issue with men. And I think that we've seen virulent strains of misandry overhanging all of culture. I think this has contributed predominantly to a lot of the issues you talk about. For example, last year in the US, it was the highest year on record for suicides, and it was
Mm.
particularly pronounced among white men up to 45, particularly when they lose their job
Yeah.
and when they lose their spouse. So I think there is a real deep crisis of meaning that, as you alluded to in the start, and we'll disentangle your personal politics because I think that we agree on the destination, but different directions of travel.
Yeah, yeah.
That leftists just aren't talking about. Other than shoe on head, no one's willing to address this. Other than maybe Christina Ember, that's slowly going, well, maybe we should ask the guys about this and let the guys take care of
Right.
themselves. Nobody's addressing it. What? Why?
Yeah.
Why is there total tone deaf silence on this?
Um, I feel like the left, and I'm a member of the left as well, so put me on that roster, very thin on the ground roster of well-meaning leftists who talk about men and boys. The left just seem to be enamored with identity politics and groups, and this conflation of leftism and liberalism is something I've still yet to understand because those are very different things. Liberalism is all about the individual and the pursuit of happiness and about freedom of speech, freedom of markets. Leftism is not about any of that really. It's about restricted speech, big government, socialism, and it's also about groups. So obviously the group identity matters more than individual. So I mean, I would say the left has a really hard time seeing men within the context of any sort of disadvantage because they're brought hook, line, and sinker into a very narrow worldview. where if you're a man, everything's excellent for everyone all of the time in every possible conceivable way. And obviously, it's worth acknowledging there are advantages to being a man, but there are also disadvantages. Um, and the left's sort of very tribal way of thinking, very much about very virtuous. It's like if someone is often more concerned about looking good than it is about doing good. And I feel like some of the things that I do that I think are doing good don't look good at all. They look very bad. Very bad, some of the things I say, very unpopular, very socially unpalatable. And I don't think the left are willing to take a step down from their soapbox and actually maybe have a few of the bitter pills they so willingly prescribe to everyone else. Like they demand accountability for everyone other than themselves and their peers. And I'm like, it's just like it makes my mind want to explode with the amount of hypocrisy I see. But I find leftism, and even more so liberalism, is very much in my bones. And I really appreciate talking to people such as yourself, because obviously there's lots of things we could disagree on. But I'm glad that we agree on wanting to help men and boys in a meaningful way. And it's quite saddening that so many of the people that I have discussion with are on the right, and so many of the research I see getting published, and so many of the newspapers that are talking about men and boys in a good way are also on the right. And I find it very alienating, but at the same time, I do respect those such as yourself who are willing to have me here. And you and I aren't natural bedfellows, Connor, but I have a lot of respect for you simply for allowing this conversation to take place.
Oh, I appreciate it, man. Thank you very much. And it's always nice to catch up and have a drink at events and that. I think maybe what might be the difference here, and I think that in how you speak about these issues, you might have a more latent traditional strain than maybe you identify, is that the leftist materialist worldview, the strains of socialism and liberalism, are sort of travelling in the same direction, but they just disagree on how to get there. And the Marxist tradition thinks violent revolution, equality is engineered by a class that's stealing profit from the workers, therefore dictatorship of the proletariat, stateless classes, communism, hey presto. Whereas the liberals are going, okay, rising tide raises all ships, free markets, these are eternal principles that we hold to be self-evident, never mind of how we're going to justify them, it's just that this is all essentially a wish list of good things. And if we get to maximum prosperity and maximum freedom, everyone's going to live in harmony and we can disentangle all the cultural war issues that are a great big distraction. But from something that you said there, it's that in the pre-industrial economy, gender wasn't really questioned because there were fundamental roles that men and women had to fulfill. And even though it was hard, just struggling for subsistence every day, and nobody wants to go back to a time of lower infant mortality, the roles were more clearly defined and you could be inextricable constituents of the same household. This is something that Ivan Illich wrote about in Gender. And so if those gender roles are shaped by time, place, technological constraints, how do you get those concrete, meaningful gender roles back when we have dislodged ourselves from the kind of restrictions that made them? That's what I think the right is focusing on. I think the right's going, well, this is how men and women were shaped. Going away from how we were shaped has made us miserable. But how do we get back to that without like the Chinese EMPing us back to the Stone Age or something mad like that? Do you know what I mean? This is what I think we need to work out a little bit. Because what are like the leftist solutions to these problems?
Well, I mean, I guess fundamentally talking about outcomes and opportunities, like you and I probably differ on how much we think there are such things as male and female behavior. I do believe there is such thing as male behavior, and I do believe there's such thing as female behavior. And I believe those two things overlap. So there are certainly more effeminate men and more masculine women. But in general, I would say men and women are different on average. And not all of that is cultural. A lot of that is biological. That's why I am like very much in the middle. But whether you think that all men are different to all women or they're roughly the same, that the solution is always the same solution. The solution is allow women and men to do whatever they want, give them equality of opportunity in as much as possible, but we shouldn't then expect them to come out at 50-50 in every possible conceivable way. So regardless of how, if we differ in our sort of belief in sort of traditional roles, I'd hope we agree on the solution being that any woman or any man should be able to do whatever they want with their life, but we shouldn't expect them all to make the exact same decision in the exact same numbers in every single possible way.
Yeah, I do think that's part of the problem with modern feminism. I mean, one of the people that's been great on this recently, even though her party seems to be going unanimously against her, is Miriam Cates, of where she's been doing internal polling and talking about family tax planning, everything from ARC to NatCon, getting excoriated by both the Guardian and the very materialistic
Mm.
Jeremy Hunt types on the front bench, who just want to influx women back into the workforce, when a vast majority of women are turning around and saying, actually, I'd like to have children, and more children if I already have children, if the economic circumstances were permitting it, but because of restricted access to housing and the necessity to get straight back to work just to afford everything, and the costs of childcare, when I'd actually rather be at home raising my own kids rather than just palming them off on someone who isn't paid very much to take care of them, well, I can't have any more. And so I think, yeah, free choice is important, but it's also looking at how the government is, and various cultural and economic pressures are clamping down on those choices that actually men and women say they want, largely in line with their biology, and they're being obstructed from bringing those to fruition.
Yeah, I do feel like there was a lot of shaming around a lot of women who want to be part-time or full-time parents. But I would say that fathers also experience that too. And I'd say the vast majority of women and the majority of men, to a lesser extent, want to be like part-time parents, part-time workers. And the polling sort of shows that the biggest, in terms of the group of people who are not getting what they want, it's not stay-at-home mums. Stay-at-homes more or less get what they want in terms of what percentage of women want to be stay-at-homes and what percentage of the society actually get that. That's very similar, but the biggest difference is in full-time working dads. Something like, I think, like 1 in 4 dads wants to be a part-time parent, and yet about 80% of dads are working full-time and get to spend very little time with their children. So I'm all for the value of motherhood, but so too am I for the value of fatherhood. And I would like to allow fathers to be part-time parents just as much as mothers if they choose to. And if they choose to not do that, then that's fine as well. I respect that part of autonomy, but I wouldn't want to forget how important fathers are in families, especially in boys, especially within the context of what society experiences in terms of like gang violence, knife crime, homelessness, male suicide. You mentioned all of these are positively benefited from the presence of more fathers at homes. So I also wouldn't want to go back to a society where the women stay at home and the dads go to work, because I just feel like that doesn't is not to the benefit of children or the family unit.
Well, yeah, that's a sort of aberration of the post-industrial working model. This is a critique of the sort of trad wife movement, where they turn around and say, well, the 1950s white picket fence America was propped up by the post-war economic order. It was a very short space of time, and actually lots of the housewives were bored out of their mind just staying at home and cleaning bits and pieces all day, while the dad is very distant from his family working in an office job. And so, of course, if the family unit isn't present and cohesive, it's more liable to being broken apart over time. Whereas actually before factory work and office work and now the knowledge economy, dads would work closer to home, they'd train up their sons in a profession, you get mentorship and vocation, and you'd get a much more cohesive, watched over and protected family unit. And I totally agree that, well, hopefully with transformations in tech, we might be able to go back to that for more families than currently the highest income bracket facilitates. So we may as well dive into your personal pet issues then, because you've been great on consolidating the data for this. What are those key issues that men and boys are facing at the moment? What aren't being talked about?
Well, I suppose the big ones are life expectancy, for example. If you're a man, you can expect to live a shorter life than a woman in every single country in the world. So men have lower life expectancy than women in all developed and developing countries. It's just like a universal observation. And then obviously men have a higher mortality rates in every single age group than women. In America, they lead in 9 of the top 10 causes of death. So when it comes to dying, men are really good at that, unfortunately. Similarly ubiquitous problem with education, for example. Um, we often use women being excluded from education as a sign of their systemic disadvantage, which has some truth to it, but not entirely. But boys now are behind in education in every single level, in more or less every single Western country, and very little has been done for it. In fact, done about it. In fact, women and girls are further ahead now in education than men and boys were 50 years ago. So it's sort of flipped and then some. So boys are now further behind. So behind at every stage of education, more likely to die pretty much in every single cause of death, more likely to die in every single country in the world. And then obviously you got I mean, not small issues, but the smaller issues of like homelessness, drug addiction, suicide, incarceration, police homicides, violent crime, homicide. Men are all dominating all of these fields, but those aren't the fields of male domination that we seem willing to talk about. They're underrepresented in many, many groups. They often don't have rights in many things that women do have rights in, such as parental rights. And things like in America, obviously you're going to have to sign up to the draft. So every single man in America has to sign away his body to the military at 18. Women don't have to do that. Very controversial, particularly on the right, talking about circumcision. But I've got big problem with circumcision. Just like any sort of surgical procedure on an unconsenting child, like the right seem very willing to talk about that within the trans discussion, which is fair enough. But no one on the right seems to be wanting to talk about male circumcision on infants. And I'm like, those are the same things. Like,
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Ideological surgery on unconsenting children, you've got to be against all of them. So there's that, and that's obviously, we're talking millions of boys, over 1 billion worldwide. And then just even more controversial still, we're talking about domestic violence and how much data there is that shows that it's not a gendered issue, and women are equally violent in relationships as men are, but less likely to cause significant injury to a male partner, but only because of their lack of physical strength in comparison to a man. And then obviously sexual violence is pretty even more controversial. And even in the country, in terms of sexual violence, even in the country where we live, Connor, it's legally impossible for a woman to even rape a man. So a lot of people I talk to on the left are campaigning for things like marital rape to be criminalized in India, which is, again, fair enough. But they don't realize that in our own country, a woman can't even rape a man by law. So that's pretty horrific. And obviously, because they not seen as rape victims, they're not included in the data. So that is just a little bit. There's plenty more. There's plenty more to come from, and obviously there's more intersectional issues. It's very much bigger than what we pretend it is. So, as a society, especially on the left, we seem to think that men and boys issues are something related to like not talking enough, not crying, and not being able to wear a dress. And I'm like, fine, but there are bigger systemic issues that are disadvantaging boys, and only a few of them I've mentioned, but there's plenty more you'll find on my page.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.